sir. Now I take the immense pleasure in introducing our second panelist for the day, Advocate Sunil Fernandez, who is an advocate on record practicing in the Supreme Court of India. Sir graduated from Mithibai College in 1997 and was honored the gold medal for obtaining first rank in political science by the University of Mumbai. He was also honored as the best student and was also appointed Secretary General and President of the Student Council of the University of Mumbai in the years 1996 and 1997. Later, he moved to Delhi and received his law degree from Delhi University in the year 2003. So has served as an additional Advocate General for the state of Madhya Pradesh in the Supreme Court of India. He has also been designated as the standing counsel for the state of Jammu Kashmir in the Supreme Court of India for 2 tenures. He is also the standing counsel for BSES in the Delhi High Court and Supreme Court since May 2009. So has conducted more than 3,000 cases since 2006, out of which 250 are reportable judgments. Some of the landmark Constitution Bench cases in which Sir were involved are striking down the validity of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, Section 497 of the Indian Penal Code, which entry of women in Sabrimala Temple, application of transfer cases under CRPC and CPC to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So was also appointed as the amicus curiae by the Honorable Supreme Court on a landmark decision based on illegal arrest of ladies. Now, I request Sir to address the gathering and to share his valuable knowledge with all our participants.
Thank you. Am I audible to everybody? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Thanks for that very generous and a very detailed introduction. And my mind wandered back to my good old days in Mithibai College. You know, I belong to a generation when Salman Khan was known for "Hum Aapke Hain Kaun" rather than "Tiger and Tiger Zinda Hai." So that's the time when I spent my period in Mithibai College, and it gives me immense pleasure to come back to have this webinar. Praveen Gandhi College, at that point of time in the 90s when I did my college, we only had Jitendra Chauhan Law College that used to operate from our main campus, from the main Mithibai building, which that time consisted only of 2 floors. And now I believe it's a huge structure, and we also have the benefit of Praveen Gandhi College there. And this is as close as it gets to my own alma mater, to my own college. So it's with immense pleasure, it's an immense happiness I have that that I've been that I have come to this webinar, and that I feel quite honored to come for this. Now, I just want the participants to just relax. What I propose to do is just have an easy conversation. I do not want you all to consider this as some sort of a lecture. Those of you all who are ready with your pens and notepads and or your laptops and quickly ready to jot down points, please don't do that. Please keep everything aside. Please just sit back, relax. Let's have an easy conversation. I'll speak barely for 10 minutes or so. I don't plan to indulge in a lengthy monologue, and I'd invite and I'd welcome more and more questions from your side, so that any doubts, any issues for which you'd like to have a clarification or discussion, that can be done. So the topic is that been asked to speak today is are the changing dynamics of PIL in India. Now, first of all, as students of law, you must be very strong on what are known as first principles. That is the basics. What do you mean by PIL? And how is a PIL distinct from any other litigation? The opposite of PIL would be, say, a private litigation. Now, to give you an example, you have a property, a house, and you are the landlord of that, and you've given it on a lease basis or rent basis to a tenant. After the tenancy period, say 1 year, 2 years, whatever period is specified, the tenant does not vacate. The remedy available to you under law is to file an eviction petition or an eviction suit or an eviction case before the concerned court. Now, when you file that case in the court, the judge asks you, why have you come to the court? Who are you? What right do you have to file the case? So you tell the judge that, Judge, this is my property. This is my tenancy. This is the tenant was supposed to vacate on so and so date. He has not vacated on so and so date. So therefore, I am the aggrieved party. My legal rights are being affected, are being infracted by his non-vacation of the property. So that right that you have to institute a case, that right is called the locus standi. So the doctrine of locus standi, that is, what right do you have to approach the court? Now, this is what is a private litigation. In public interest litigation, the person who approaches the court does not have a direct link with the subject matter, or is expected not to have a direct link with the subject matter. He is doing it solely in the larger interest of the people, or larger interest of public at large, and B, on behalf of those category of citizens who are themselves not able to approach the Supreme Court or the High Court wherever a writ petition is filed. Writ petitions can be filed only in two places: under Article 226 before the High Courts, and under Article 32 before the Supreme Court, 32 the Constitution of India. So what the Supreme Court has done is, or the entire PIL jurisprudence as it evolves, is it relaxes the doctrine of locus standi. So for example, has students in Praveen Gandhi College, if you feel that there has been an illegal destruction of trees, say in RA forest or in any of the environmentally protected areas in Mumbai, you all can file a public interest litigation before the Bombay High Court and tell the court that, see, we don't stay in the vicinity, we have nothing to do with the project, we have nothing to do with the tree cutting, but as conscientious and law-abiding citizens of this country, we believe that cutting down of these hundreds of thousands of trees will be damaging, will be inimical to our environment of the city, and therefore as citizens, as residents and law-conscious citizens of Mumbai, we have approached the court to stop the felling of the trees. So when you approach the court where you don't have a direct interest, see, there may be a very, very incident, of course, because of the air pollution levels decrease in the city, of course you will benefit. If there is a better environment in the city, of course you would benefit. So I'm not talking of a very indirect, very tangential, incidental benefit that may accrue. No direct benefit. Like I gave the earlier example of your property not being vacated by the tenant and you file a eviction petition, there you have a direct interest in the outcome of the case. Here there is no personal direct interest involved. So the two important aspects of public interest litigation that you must understand. Firstly, you must understand how distinct it is from a private litigation, how different it is from a private litigation. And secondly, it is filed on behalf of those people who are not able to approach the court. And therefore the court, recognizing the noble objective behind you moving the court, relaxes the doctrine of locus standi and permits you to file this case, which otherwise the court would not have permitted. You see, for example, I'll give you another example. Supposing as students of Praveen Gandhi College, you all file one student of Praveen Gandhi College files a writ petition in the High Court saying that Mr. X was supposed to be admitted in Government Law College, but Government Law College has denied him admission on a very flimsy ground. So the court will say that we'll see whether Government Law College is right or wrong in denying the admission. But boss, who are you? What right do you have to come to court on behalf of a student who's getting admitted in GLC or could have been admitted in GLC? Did you apply in GLC? Answer is no. Were you one of the candidates in contention? Answer is no. If this gentleman doesn't get the seat, are you going to get the seat? Answer is no. If this gentleman gets the seat, are you anyway connected or benefited? Answer is no. Then why have you come? You see? So therefore, you must understand that unless and until there is a public interest objective involved, you just can't butt in someone else's case. See, that's very important, to understand these basic principles. So public interest litigation does not mean that you can jump in any and every matter or bring in any and every case before the court. As I said, in public interest litigation, the rule of locus standi, the court will relax, provided you are able to demonstrate before the court that the issue that you are bringing before the court has an overarching public interest. Now there is a judgment of the Supreme Court, just note down the citation if you all want, and to those interested we will circulate the soft copy of these 2-3 judgments that I will cite. So I don't believe in citing many, just 2-3 relevant ones, because I believe it's rather than reading 10 judgments superficially, it is important that you will read 2 or 3 relevant ones, but read it page to page, para to para. Only then you will be able to understand the entire complexity and the depth of the judgment. So there's a judgment of the Supreme Court in SP Gupta's case, which was the first judge's case, 1981, Supplementary 1, SCC 87, where the Supreme Court's judgment itself dwells upon the evolution of the doctrine of public interest. How did the PIL, public interest litigation, evolve? So essentially it's an American doctrine evolved in America in the 1950s. Most of you all would be probably aware of the fact that America had racially segregated schools, colleges, and everything. So, for example, there were separate schools for the white people, separate school for black people. And then the entire civil liberties movements arose in America where they wanted to end this blatant racial discrimination. And those people started filing cases, and the US Supreme Court relaxed the doctrine of locus standi, permitted those people to file such cases so that various racial segregation measures can be dismantled. And one of the landmark judgments of the US Supreme Court was in 1958 in Brown versus Board of Education, whereby they struck down this principle of racially segregated schools. So we have this 1981 SP Gupta's case, Constitution Bench judgment, 7 judges, where they have dwelt at length as to how did the PIL jurisdiction originated. So initially, when the PIL jurisdiction originated, there's one very important judgment of the Supreme Court in Bandhwa Mukti Morcha's case, which is 1984. Now, in Bandhwa Mukti Morcha's case, at that point of time, the Chief Justice of India was one Justice P.N. Bhagwati. Justice Bhagwati received a postcard on behalf of the bonded laborers, saying that they have been kept in very difficult and very inhumane conditions. He converted that postcards, and in these days of social media and Twitter and Insta, very difficult to visualize what a postcard would be. But it's rectangular in shape in which you write. You can ask your parents, they would tell you what a postcard is. So a postcard was sent to the Supreme Court, and in which they had written it down that we had these problems. And the postcard was converted into a public interest litigation by the Supreme Court itself. And based on that, they passed various directions and various orders. So initially in the 80s, when the PIL jurisdiction evolved in India, and you essentially have to give credit to Justice P.N. Bhagwati, who was a CJI at that point of time, and then some very notable line of justices thereafter, who took up the causes of these absolutely unprivileged section of the society. So you had Bandhwa Mukti Morcha for bonded laborers. You had another jail petition by Sunil Batra with regards to the inhumane conditions in the jail. Then you had another one from Hussain Ara Khatun about the right of speedy trial. Under trials were languishing for decades altogether. Then you had Olga Tellis from Bombay. She's a social activist, also a lawyer, with regards to the welfare of pavement dwellers. Then you had MC Mehta's case, which is still pending, filed in 1985, which dealt with the environmental aspects all over the country against pollution. Then you had T.N. Godavarman in the mid-90s, which dealt with forest rights, and that petition also is still pending. So the initial evolution of PILs in the 1980s was essentially to reflect and to give some support, some legal support to the socially and economically exploited, underprivileged people who on their own could have never come to the Supreme Court. On their own, they never had the means, the education, the wherewithal, the prospects of coming to the Supreme Court. So it's on behalf of that segment that Supreme Court initially initiated its PIL jurisdiction. Then that is the initial stage. Then the next stage came when there were matters pertaining to environment, to pollution, air pollution, water pollution, degradation of forest cover. So the next stage, Supreme Court got involved. PILs were a measure for the Supreme Court to rectify all these problems, because apparently the governments of the day didn't do their job. There was tremendous denigration of our forest cover. Environmental norms were being liberally flouted, and therefore the Supreme Court had to step in. So these environmental PILs constitute the second phase, or the next evolution of PIL jurisprudence in this country. After that, the third phase came about, whereby Supreme Court got involved in what are known as social causes. So we have a couple of landmark judgments of the Supreme Court. You have the Vishaka guidelines, whereby there was no law in the country to deal with sexual harassment at workplaces. There is now, which came up 15 years after the Vishaka judgment, but Supreme Court dealt with that in the late 90s, in 97, and said that there has to be a law to deal with sexual harassment in workplaces. And since the Parliament has not enacted any law, we will then give the guidelines, and these guidelines will hold the force of law. And till the time the Parliament doesn't enact any law, these guidelines will play the role of a law. And these guidelines did continue for the next 15 years until Parliament, I think 2015-16, enacted a legislation on prevention of sexual harassment in workplace. Then another judgment of the Supreme Court in the late 90s was in Vinit Narayan's case, where there was no clear-cut guidelines laid down for the functioning of the CBI, the Central Bureau of Investigation. So therefore, Supreme Court stepped in and gave detailed guidelines as to how shall the CVC, the CBI function till such a time that the law is not made. So this was the third phase of the PI litigation. I'm just giving you broad things, just for your easy understanding. The third phase of Supreme Court was when they dwelt into, these matters of social and public importance. And the fourth phase, if you can say, came up out in this century, where economic measures were being challenged before the court. You had the 2G scam, the coal scam, and it's difficult now to call them scams because no one's been convicted 10 years down the line, and all the people who were accused have been acquitted. But that's how it's commonly known, so I'll just stick to the common interpretation. So all these so-called scams took place, and those scams, the PIs were filed, and Supreme Court then passed a slew of directions. Today, any major economic measure, be it disinvestment in airports, disinvestment in public sector companies, bringing about greater foreign direct investment in the country, bringing about a single window system for foreign entities. If you have, for example, we have the C-Link. So supposing if the C-Link itself was subject matter of several PIs in the Bombay High Court, they are planning to extend the C-Link, from Worli right up till Kolaba and from Bandra up to Warsaw. So they are planning to do all that, and you can brace yourself for a slew of public interest litigations on those counts. So all the major economic measures were being subject matter of public interest litigations in the courts. So these are the way that public interest litigation evolved. Initially from the underprivileged and the extremely poor sections of the society which did not have access to the court. Then you go to environment, then you go to social causes, and then you go to economic policy. This is how it evolved. Now, what is the flip side? The flip side of PILs are beautifully delineated in two judgments. First one would be Balwant Singh Chaufal, 2010 judgment. I'll just give you the citation. 2010 3 SCC page 402. Balwant Singh Chaufal versus State of Uttarakhand. And the second one is a recent one of Justice D.Y. Chandrachud. Balwant Singh Chaufal's judgment was authored by Justice Dalveer Bhandari. And just an important tidbit of fact, Justice Bhandari today is in the International Court of Justice at Hague, and he was one of the judges who heard the Kulbhushan Jadhav case that was going on in Hague, or still is going on in the Hague. So that time he was a judge of the Supreme Court. He came up with these with the negative effects of PIL jurisprudence in this country. And then in 2018, Justice Dhananjay Chandrachud, our future Chief Justice of India, would be comes from the Bombay High Court. He also has authored a judgment on the misuse of PIL in Tehseen Poonawala's case. The Tehseen Poonawala's case is 2018 origin. So we'll have this judgment circulated. So we'll have SP Gupta, Balwant Singh Chaufal, and Tehseen Poonawala's email to your moderator, and she would be, I think, kind enough to give it to everybody who wants it. So don't fret on it. Just for the time being, just sit back and just hear me out. So in Balwant Singh Chaufal, Supreme Court has come up with has delineated a problem of public interest litigation. So the evolution of PIL was supposed to be a very holistic, very salutary purpose. It has now degenerated into what is known as publicity interest litigation, or private interest litigation, where we have professional PIL walas whose only job is to just keep on filing PILs. You see, so and sometimes they may be actuated by genuine interest, genuine bona fide interest, but sometimes they are also actuated by certain ulterior motives. Now I'll give you an example. For example, there is a company, just to give you the same, the Bandra Worli ceiling example. Supposing one company is awarded the contract of extending the ceiling from Worli right up to Kolaba, or from Worli right up to, say, Haji Ali or Nariman Point. Now you are, for example, I am of company number, it's the second company, company B, who lost out on that tender. Company A has won it, I have lost it out. Now one way is, if there is any hanky-panky in the awarding of the tender, I can file a writ petition in my own name and say that, sorry, this tender should not have been given to company A. I should have got that tender. I am the better bidder. But assuming there is no hanky-panky, everything is transparent, you cannot file a case, or even if you file a case, you cannot hope to win. So then what you do? How do you damage the interest of that company A which has got the tender? You get a public interest litigation filed in the Bombay High Court. And that fellow will file a PIL saying that I am a conscientious, law-abiding and very aware citizen of this country. I have come to know from newspaper reports that the extension of the Bandra Worli ceiling right up till Nariman Point has been awarded to Company A. Now, about this Company A, this is the material that I have. Now, this Company A is a hopeless company. It's the funds of this company are got from black money sources. The directors are involved in various criminal activities. This company will siphon off public funds. They will take money from the government, not build the flyover. They have a hopeless track record. They are guilty of violating certain norms in the past. These are the examples. So what I will do, I will give this entire data, this entire material to a so-called public interest litigation petitioner, and he will file it and he will discredit that company. So imagine if once it comes before the court and the court sees all this material, and if it gets alarmed or worried and issues notice, then the very prospect of that project being executed comes to a standstill. So this is one way where political and commercial rivalries are being taken out under the garb of PIL. So you have a public interest litigant ostensibly filing it in public interest, but what he's doing is he's taking the dope, the material from the commercial rivals, and then using it. Now, for example, some important post, let's say the vice chancellor's post of Bombay University, that is being, one person knows that Mr. A or Mrs. A is the lead, is the front runner, and this post is going to go to him or her. And supposing Bombay University vice chancellor, that person, Mr. A, gets appointed to. So what the other fellow will do is he will now file a PIL saying that no, sorry, you have appointed A, but there are these many things against A. So what could not be done directly is being done indirectly through the garb of public interest litigation, where personal, political and commercial rivalries are being played out. And this the courts have realized, the last 15-20 years, PIL jurisprudence is being progressively abused. The original purpose and intent of PIL has taken a totally different shape. Another breed of professional PIL litigants are the blackmailers. So they know, like in this example I gave of the company which has won the Haji Ali the Bandra Worli extension contract. Now, assuming there is no company B which is agreed by company A, but there is a very smart operator. Most of them either are lawyers or they are so-called public citizens. They feel that, oh, now this company has got such a huge contract. What I will do is I'll draft a PIL and file it against this company in the High Court. The company will then approach me, pay me an X amount and buy peace. Because for them to fight this litigation, to suffer a stay, the economic costs are far greater than paying some amount and settling with this fellow. So PILs have also become a tool for blackmailing. So if you want to extract any commercial benefit, if you want to damage any person, if you want to threaten any person, file a PIL and then cause and start hammering against that person concerned, in the hope that that entity or the person will then come back to you and try and settle it, give you and whatever has to be given, and that will be a very tidy packet that you can earn. So Supreme Court has become aware of these problems. That today PIL jurisprudence has been grossly misused. The original purpose of what PILs was and today how things stand are vastly different. And that is what in Balwant Singh Chaufal's case from para 25 onwards, if you see, the Supreme Court has dealt with it beautifully. It has not only noticed the evolution of public interest litigation in this country, it has also examined and also enumerated the various instances of its gross abuse. And this is also what you would find in Tehseen Poonawala's judgment 2018 6 SCC page 72 at para 96 onwards. So these are the three judgments. Anyone who wants to do some further reading into this, is interested or whose curiosity is piqued by this webinar, can look into these three judgments. SP Gupta, Balwant Singh Chaufal and Tehseen Poonawala to understand the contours of PIL litigation. So I think that's all from my side, and I've attempted to give you a general broad overview of the PILs as it originated in the US in the 1950s till its current evolution and with changing dynamics in India right up till 2018-20. So I'll be happy to take questions.
Yes, sir, it was a really very informative for all of us, the knowledge you imparted. So, sir, I'll be moderating today's session.
Sure.
Sir, we have the first question. How do judges conduct their due diligence while ensuring that a particular PIL is truly for the welfare of the public and not for implicit personal gain?
See, there is it's a very difficult thing for the judges. How do they conduct their due diligence? They don't have any mechanism. So therefore, one of the ways is they try to pose various questions to the petitioner who's before them to see whether does he have genuinely any interest, or does he genuinely have expertise in the subject matter which he claims to be, agitating before the court, or he is just merely set up by somebody. So that's one part. Second part also goes broadly as to the person who comes before the Supreme Court. What are his credentials? Now, for example, if an unknown entity comes before the Supreme Court and talks about matters of great public importance, the court may be very suspicious about his motives. But you have, supposing a person of renown, for example, if I were to go to Supreme Court and say that the Board of Cricket Control is not being run very properly, and there are several reforms need to be done. So they will tell me, Mr. Fernandes, go back, just prepare your case properly and help us. Don't get into all this. But if Sachin Tendulkar were to go and file a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court, saying that no, BCCI is not being run, or the cricket infrastructure is being run in a very corrupt manner by the administrators, of course they will sit up and take this. So one of the ways by which the courts can separate the genuine guys from the fraud guys is firstly who has come. So that's very important. His credentials has to be very, very impeccable. And secondly, they also look at the petition. How well it is drafted. Is it genuinely in public interest? By virtue of the public interest, are they trying to insert some personal agenda? So judges are wise enough. They are smart enough. So most of the time they are able to catch the mischievous PIL litigant from the genuine ones. Sometimes they are not, but most of the times, I would say an overwhelmingly large number of times the judges are able to find it out. Yeah, next question.
So the next question is, what are your views on the constitutional validity of Section 2C, Subclause 1 of the Contempt of Court Act 1971, under which Prashant Bhushan was recently convicted? Few days ago, ICJ has also called for a review of the law. Will that have any effect?
See, I don't think so. The International Court of Justice has any jurisdiction to comment on our domestic laws. It's up to the Parliament and up to the Supreme Court to decide as to what our laws would be. So the short answer to your question is I don't think ICJ has any business into this. Second aspect of this answer is, see, this is a matter for the Parliament to take it up. So today the court can only proceed based on what the law is. The law in this country, as far as Contempt of Court Act goes, under Section 2, provides for civil as well as criminal contempt. Now, criminal contempt as a concept has been long led gone by the advanced legal jurisdictions of the world, like say US or UK. They don't have these criminal contempt provisions anymore. So there are views on both the sides, and very persuasive views on both the sides. One aspect is the narrower aspect is that whatever Mr. Bhushan said, does it tantamount to contempt? Should the court have proceeded against him under contempt of court jurisdiction? That's the smaller part of the problem. The larger issue is whether should contempt jurisdiction at all be there. You see, that's the larger part, the larger question, the bigger question, which ICJ is involved itself, saying that the existence of criminal contempt jurisdiction for the courts, is detrimental to the fundamental rights of the citizens of the country. See, under Article 19 of the Constitution, you have the right of freedom of expression and speech. So that section of people who are against Section 2 of the Contempt of Court Act say that when the court exercises criminal contempt over its own for the contempt of its own self, it actually violates the Article 19 rights of the citizens. So my job is to give you the pros and cons. You see, it's up to you all to decide, whether it should remain or it should not remain. The advantages of this is that it gives some legal weapon in the hands of the judges to discipline or to prevent any mischievous person from damaging the institution and from destroying the faith in the judiciary. But the flip side is, the other side is that this is an outdated concept. Most of the advanced jurisdictions don't use this concept, and the possibility of misuse of this concept and infraction of the Article 19 rights of the citizen whenever this is exercised is very high. So these are the two viewpoints on it.
Coming forward to the next question, what measures do you suggest to stop wrong use of PILs so private parties cannot benefit their interest through filing PILs?
See, there is no quick fix solution to this. There is no glib answer. I can't give you a one-line answer as to, how do we prevent fraudulent PILs, because I'm sure someone brighter than me would have thought about this and I would have already implemented it. So the very fact that we don't have a norm or a rule, to filter out bad PILs means that it's almost next to impossible to filter out bad PILs. But I think what can be done is, these are just thoughts that just come off my mind. The courts must themselves largely decide as to which are the areas they would like to interfere in public interest and which are the areas they're going to keep off. Like, for example, say economic policy. Economic policy is something now whether you have say state you have the ST, in Maharashtra you have the Maharashtra State Road Transport Corporation, which runs the ST buses. Now, supposing the state government takes a decision that we want to privatize it, we want to sell it off. Now, should the courts interfere in this? Do they have the expertise to decide whether it should be sold off or not sold off? Whether should the government run it or should the private sector run it? Whether should the government retain a 49% equity or whether it should retain a 26% equity? I mean, these are matters which are purely in the economic domain. So I think for starters, maybe some self-imposed restrictions would be good, where the Supreme Court can decide that we will not interfere in certain aspects and we will interfere only in areas where we are actually called for. That's number one. And number two, there has to be very strict scrutiny of the antecedents of the petitioner. Now, for example, if I say that India is doing a massive mistake by importing military helicopters from America. This is supposing we have Apache, Chinook. These are military level helicopters which India is currently importing from the US. Now, if I file a PIL against that import, now the courts must really grill me as to who are you? Do you have any military expertise to decide this? Who are you to say that Apache should not be purchased and say a Sikorsky must be purchased? Who are you to say that this helicopter is bad and that helicopter is good? What expertise do you have? And if you have that expertise, from where have you got that expertise? Who has given you this information? You are not in the defense sector. You are not a military expert. You are not an aviation expert. So how do you get all this? So you see, the second way in which you can filter out is that the petitioner's bona fides must be severely scrutinized, must be strongly tested. Only then you will come to know whether these are the various filtering. Of course, there will be someone who will still be able to get through all this. But so you can't totally eliminate fraudulent PILs, and I think that's not humanly possible either. But what should happen is you should attempt to scrutinize and to nullify as many fraudulent PILs as possible. So you can keep the filtering process strong. That's what is required for. Emily?
So the next question, this is regarding the judgment in the Rhea Chakrabarti transfer petition. What are your views on the exercise of powers under Article 142 by a single judge while transferring a criminal investigation?
See, this is again a gray area because again, my job, rather than giving you my view, because that would be very pompous on my part to give you a view. I'll give you the pros and cons. I'll give you the view in favor of this. I'll give you a view against it, and then you all can decide. See, the ones who are against it say that a single judge of the Supreme Court cannot exercise powers under 142. Why? Because he was exercising only the transfer powers under Section 406 of the CRPC. Section 406 of the CRPC says transfer of a case from one state to another state can be done by the Supreme Court. So the transfer petition that Rhea Chakrabarti had filed to transfer the FIR from Patna to Mumbai was dismissed by the single judge in the Supreme Court on the ground that no FIR can be transferred only when the FIR culminates into a charge sheet, into a criminal case. Only then it can be transferred. Otherwise, you cannot have a transfer for an FIR under 406. So therefore, on that ground, the single judge held that 406 is not maintainable, it is premature, and dismissed the transfer petition of Rhea Chakrabarti. Now there is one thought, group of thought on this, that once the single judge had dismissed 406 of Rhea Chakrabarti, that was the end of the matter. There was no occasion for the single judge to go into whether and test whether the CBI should be given this, or whether the Patna police was right, or whether the Mumbai police was right. Well, all these things are beyond the jurisdiction of the single judge. So therefore, the single judge had no business doing that. What the single judge should have simply said is dismiss the 406 and left the parties to whatever remedies they are available after that. The other school of thought on this is that what the Supreme Court has done is it has done substantial justice, because Supreme Court is the final court of the country. It is expected to settle all the issues that arise before it, whether directly or indirectly. So a normal civil court would not be having those powers, those plenary powers that the Supreme Court has. So therefore it has exercised those powers in order to finalize all the outstanding issues. For example, we all know that apart from the transfer, one of the issues would have also cropped up is whether the action of the Patna police in transferring the case to CBI, and CBI also coming and jumping in this litigation in the Supreme Court, whether is that valid or no. So one way what the Supreme Court has done is it has decided all outstanding issues. And to decide all outstanding issues which goes beyond the realm of 406 CRPC, it has taken recourse of Article 142 of the Constitution, which is a power available only to Supreme Court and no other court in this country, not even the High Courts. So that is one school of thought which says that they have settled all the issues so as to clear all the controversy, rather than had they answered only one issue, left the other issues open, then there would be needless litigation, and then again it would reach to Supreme Court, then again Supreme Court would have to decide. So this way what the single judge has done is, who was in charge of this matter, he has decided all outstanding issues, and to do that he has taken recourse to 142, which is a valid exercise of 142. So these are the two schools of thought. Yes.
Okay. Moving forward, sir, what are the points to keep in mind when we argue the constitutional validity of any provision to declare something unconstitutional?
Of a constitutional provision or a statutory provision?
Constitutional validity of a provision.
Well, see, I'll give you a recent example. What we had, the NJAC, National Judicial Accountability Commission, which wanted to have a different method or way of appointment of judges. So there was amendment in the Constitution to bring about this new system. Article 124 capital A was inserted, and all that was challenged before the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court actually upheld the challenge and struck down a constitutional provision. So one of the major grounds and the most important ground to assail a constitutional amendment is violation of the basic structure. So that's your first and probably the most important, or rather the only substantial point in your favor, is a constitutional amendment that is violative of the basic structure has to be struck down. And the basic structure doctrine given by the celebrated case of Keshwanand Bharti, 1973, 4 SCC, page 225. First time and the only time that the Supreme Court sat in a combination of 13 judges. So never ever have 13 judges of Supreme Court sat. 11 have sat, 9 have sat, and 7 have sat, but never ever 13, except in that one single case in 1973, a judgment which was pronounced on 24th of April 1973. And I give this date because for all cricket lovers, and especially for Mumbai, it's a very important date because Sachin Tendulkar was born on that day. So in Delhi, we had Keshwanand Bharti, which for lawyers is the most important judgment. And in Mumbai, for cricket lovers, the most important development was his birth. So on the same day, we had Keshwanand and Sachin Tendulkar both making their debut in this world. So anyway, so just to come back to it, so Keshwanand Bharti says that any constitutional amendment, if it is violative of the basic structure, shall be struck down. Now, what is basic structure? The Constitution of India, nowhere, 395 articles we have in the Constitution, nowhere specifies what basic structure is. So that the Supreme Court in Keshwanand Bharti and subsequent other 3, 4, 5, 6 major constituent judgments have specified as to what basic structure is. Now this NJAC judgment was struck down on the ground that the independence of judiciary is a basic structure of the Constitution, and any amendment of the Constitution that takes away independence of the judiciary shall be struck down. Similarly, Article 14, right to equality, Article 21, right to life. These all are secularism, rule of law, democracy. These all are basic structure doctrine. Supposing tomorrow the parliament, with the brute majority that the parliament currently has, it brings about an amendment saying that the prime minister is prime minister for life, no elections. And it is passed by a majority of votes, both in Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha, and the president signs this amendment. Can this amendment stand? So it can't, because once it goes to the court, it is violative of the doctrine of rule of law. It is violative of the doctrine of democracy, which is held to be fundamental to the Constitution. So you don't have to specify anywhere in the Constitution that the prime minister should not be prime minister for life. That's not needed. What is to be seen is that any measure, any act, any constitutional amendment by the parliament, does it violate one of the core principles of our constitution? Like, for example, I just came towards the fag end of Shri Ashwini Upadhyay's speech about the 10-year reservation thing that was specified. See, the 10-year reservation period has been progressively increased. Now, if you challenge it on the ground that it is violative of the basic structure, it won't succeed, because providing reservations or not providing reservations is not a part of a basic structure. Democracy, secularism, republican form of government, the election, fair and free elections, right to life under Article 21, right to equality under Article 14, right to clean air, right to right against unfair arrest, right of personal liberty. These are around a dozen odd rights which may or may not be clearly specified in the Constitution, but you can clearly draw that inference from the Constitution that these rights are so basic, so important, that they constitute the basic structure of our Constitution. And any amendment that seeks to tinker with this basic structure has to be thrown out. Anything other than basic structure, if it sought to be changed, no problem, that can be done. But so it's a huge circle, that is a Constitution, a Venn diagram. Within that there is a smaller circle, so that within that smaller circle is the basic structure circle. You can't touch that. The outer larger part of that circle, you are free to amend it as per the changing needs and changing times, but you can't touch the basic structure of our Constitution under the powers of amendment under Article 368 of the Constitution. Yes, ma'am.
Can a PI be filed to restrain the executive to implement or bring in force any particular act of parliament, or does that violate the principle of separation of powers?
No, it violates. It would. Such a PI would straight away violate the principle of separation of powers. You can't say that don't enforce this act. You can say that strike down this act. You see, as a lawyer, please understand this difference. Very soon you will cross the threshold as a student and enter the legal field as lawyers. We all would be colleagues and contemporaries. So it's very important for you to understand these basics. And I repeatedly urge, my friends here who are currently listening to this webinar, that please understand the basic, the fundamental, the underlying principle beyond this. Now, this question, for example, the short answer to that, I can say that, sorry, no, you can't ask for any such direction in a PIL, that don't implement the law. That's my short answer. But that is not what should satisfy you all. What should satisfy you all is when I answer why can't we ask such a direction. So not only don't merely satisfy yourself by knowing the short answer. Satisfy yourself only when you understand the underlying principle behind that answer. So the underlying principle behind this answer is, as rightly pointed out, that if a mere prayer is made that please don't implement this, that violates the doctrine of separation of power. Courts have no business to stop, the judiciary has no business to stop the legislature from making laws and executive from implementing the laws. What the judiciary has powers is striking down a law if it is violative of any of the fundamental rights or of principles of natural justice, or if it is unreasonable, arbitrary. Supposing, as I said, if there is a law made by Parliament saying that every person who goes to vote must deposit 1 lakh rupees with the election agent before he casts his vote. That's a law made by Parliament, approved by Lok Sabha, approved by Rajya Sabha, sent to the President signs it. You can't file a PIL saying that, Milords, on the face of it, this is such an onerous provision, this is such a bad provision, please pass a direction to the central government that they should not implement this law. No, sorry, they can't do that. You have to file a PIL saying that, see, this law that has been made by the Parliament places such an onerous restriction on the person who is seeking to vote that it is violative of his right to vote. It is violative of his right under Article 21, under Article 14. It is violative of the various electoral laws in the country which promise a free and fair equal opportunity for all voters to cast their vote, and therefore it should be struck down. And the courts can strike it down. It's within the remit of their powers. So don't satisfy yourself with merely knowing the right answer, which is of course important. Also understand the reasons behind the right answer. And this endeavor should be there constantly throughout your legal career. That it is a twofold exercise. A, knowing the right answer. B, knowing the reasons for the right answer. And only when B is done is your A exercise complete. Yeah.
Sir, do you agree that of late there is a high degree of judicial overreach in form of PILs? Do you think it's affecting the basic doctrine of separation of powers?
See, this is judicial overreach has been a very old, as in it's not recent for several decades. This issue is very live. See, I mean, I normally don't venture out to give personal opinions because I believe you all should know both sides of the story and then make your own mind rather than just merely imbibing whatever I say. I mean, I'm not a political leader who wants you to believe every word that I say is gospel truth. So I'd rather provoke your mental faculties that you all should think and find out what is the correct answer. Now there are the two sides of this. The side which says that there is judicial overreach, of course there are a lot of examples. You see the courts have gone all over the place in so many areas where normally they shouldn't, and they've bitten off more than they can chew. They're not able to finish up these matters, and it only leads to a greater backlog of cases. We have crores and crores of cases which are today pending in our courts with very, very poor infrastructure. The funds are not allocated. We don't have that many judges, infrastructure, etc., etc. The other side of the story is that you see there is now, for example, you see every monsoons, you see the state of roads in Mumbai. You see the problem of waterlogging. It happens every monsoon, and the municipal corporation there is the richest in the country, and yet you face this problem every monsoon. Now it's very clear that the legislature and the executive have failed to perform this basic duty. The basic duty is to just give you a proper road where you can travel without having the fear of injury, without the fear of being suffering grievous injury. They don't do that. So what would you do? So where is the option now? For example, environment. So everybody knows that today India is facing a massive challenge on the environment front. But you have babus, you have netas who are probably in collusion with the industries and industrial owners, and they give a total go-by to the environmental norms, to the pollution norms. The city suffers, the air quality suffers. Where would you go? So it's very easy to say that there's judicial overreach, but judicial overreach happens when the citizen is left with no alternative. So the legislature is not helping him, the executive is not helping him, the state assembly or the central parliament are not making laws for this effect. And even if the laws are made, the executive, that is the government, is not implementing it strictly or implementing it selectively, depending upon who's their favorite and who's not. And ultimately the public interest suffers. So in such a scenario, where would a citizen go? The courts are the only option left. So I think you can't. I would like to conclude this answer by saying that you can't fully blame the Supreme Court or the High Courts for judicial overreach. A large part of the blame has to be laid at the doorsteps of the legislature and the executive. It is because they have not performed their duties with the necessary equanimity or with the necessary dedication and force. That's the reason why a vacuum is created, and that vacuum is then filled by what is known as quote unquote judicial overreach. Yamin, next question.
You talked about the locus standi in case of PILs. What about a writ petition? If a person has some personal interest in the matter, but that matter affects people at large.
See, all PILs are writ petitions. Let's again get this concept clear. There's no separate petition called a PIL. PILs are writ petitions. They are filed under Article 32 in the Supreme Court. They are filed under Article 226 in the High Court. So therefore, all writs are not PILs, but all PILs are writs. Okay, so that's one part of the answer you must understand. Now you file a writ petition. In a writ, if you say that no, this is not a PIL, this is a writ, then you are bound by the doctrine of locus standi. Then you'll have to demonstrate as to how you are independently affected by it. Like for example, you are staying in Chembur and trees are being cut, say in Goregaon East. You file a writ petition. Mind you don't file a PIL, although it's under the provisions is the same. Under Article 226, you approach the Bombay High Court. But the difference is instead of putting it as a public interest litigation, you say that no, I want to file a writ. So moment you say that you want to file a writ and moment you write that it's a writ petition, the doctrine of locus standi would immediately start applying to you. So when it comes up before the judge would ask him, Madam, you have filed this writ? Well, yes. where the trees are being cut. So bola in Are, in Goregaon East. Where are you? In Chembur. So how are you affected? Are these your trees? Well, no. Is it next to your house? Well, no. By their being there, are you being affected? Well, no. By not being there, are you being affected? No. Then why have you filed? No, but these are trees. I live in the same city, Chembur ho, Goregaon East ho, Bhandup ho. How does it matter? If you're going to cut trees, I'm also affected. ऐसा तो नहीं होगा कि pollution will remain only in Goregaon East and will not come to Chembur and Bhandup and Mulund, isn't it? So if that is so, then that is public interest. That is not your personal interest or a locus standi. So that is the distinction. It's a very fine but a very crucial distinction where a writ petition mutates or evolves or proceeds into the domain of PIL. So the locus standi again is very, very important. Just because you have an altruistic purpose, a very noble purpose, doesn't mean that you can institute a writ petition. Sorry. If then that is so, then you mention or you style your writ petition as a public interest litigation. But if you are going to restrict your petition only as a writ petition, then you have to be directly and materially affected. For example, if there is a tree right outside your house, which is a source of great amount of ecological comfort, and if that tree is being cut in violation of the environment norms, by all means you can file a writ petition saying that sorry, this tree is right outside my house, I am directly affected. But a tree which is located 20 kilometers away, you're not directly affected. So there you'll have to file a PI. So this is the short answer. Tree outside your house in Chembur, writ. Tree in Are, PI. Okay. Next one.
Very nice example. So moving ahead, so we would like to know pros and cons of the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 in alignment with the doctrine of the basic structure.
You have to then invite me for a separate webinar. You can't ask me one question, the answer of which take me 20 minutes to explain. It's a huge one. Someday I would prefer that we have a chance. But just a very quick, since the question has been asked and it's too tempting not to answer. Again, CAA is a very hotly contested thing. And those cases are being challenged right now in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has not yet found the time to adjudicate them. And in fact, one of the criticisms during the Prashant Bhushan contempt was this, that there are several burning issues before the Supreme Court. One of them is the CAA. And Supreme Court, rather than paying attention to those issues, adjudicating those issues, spent a humongous amount of time trying to discipline a private citizen, a single lawyer. So this is another aspect of it. Of course, rest assured there are pros and cons on both the sides in the CA, but it's a very interesting topic, and someday it requires a full-fledged discussion. You can't just get the correct picture by, because it's a pretty complex topic. You can't just give a glib answer in 2 minutes and do justice to it. Yeah.
Then moving forward, initially PIL judgments are becoming landmark cases over the years. The scenario has changed. Does this mean that unnecessary PILs are being filed, or more and more matters are being addressed by various advocates in different parts of the country?
Yes, they are. That's the reason why I said please read Balwant Singh Chaufal, 2010 Supreme Court, and Tehseen Poonawalla, 2018 Supreme Court. They have discussed this at length as to how the unfortunate aspect is what came about as a very noble concept, as today, because of its abuse, has become something of a very suspicious thing for the judges. So whenever a PIL comes, the judges are highly suspicious of any PIL in any court. That's the unfortunate part. So those judgments have dealt with it beautifully, and I would really heartily recommend that you should spend some time reading it and reread it. Just don't read it once, read it thrice. So that you all are able to understand it in its entirety. Just reading it once would be like reading a novel or a newspaper. Don't do that. Read it thrice. Read it once. Read it again the second time to find out whether what you understood the first time is correct, and read it the third time to verify that what you understood the first and second time is correct. So when all three times that you have read and you have understood the same thing, that's when the judgment is finally internalized inside. Yes, please. Next question, Millie.
Yes, sir. So what are your views on secularism and socialist imposed on our country at the time of emergency when there was no opposition in the country to argue on it? And can you talk this on unconstitutional and abolish these two terms from the preamble?
See, that is, it's a misconception. The term secular and socialist came about in the 42nd Amendment in 1976. when we were under an emergency. Emergencies from June 1975 till Jan 1977. So in between whatever laws came are the emergency laws. But it's not that from 1950 when our constitution was finally came into force till 1976, India was not a secular country. India was not a socialist country, and it became only in 1976. I'm sorry, that's not the case. If you look at our constitution, if holistically, it gives equal rights to everybody. Equal rights to everybody, irrespective of their religion, race, language, caste, creed. And I'll just give you a very short example. Again, this is a topic which would need great deal of discussion. See, I'll give you a short example of the Constitution of Pakistan. The Constitution of Pakistan or Constitution of Bangladesh officially contains in their constitution that it's an Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So a religion is given an official status, an official constitutional status. Whenever a religion, any religion is given an official constitutional status, that country cannot be a secular country, broadly speaking. But in India, if you see the constitution that came into force on 26th of November 1949, it was fully ready and it was finally came into force on 26th of Jan 1950. So forget this amendment of 1976. Look at what was the original constitution in 1950 and pick up the Bare Act and see this constitution and ignore the fact whether the preamble contains secular and socialism. Can anybody say that our constitution is not secular on a holistic reading of all the articles of our constitution? Does our constitution give special rights to any specific religion? Does our constitution, Article 14 rights, does it say that Hindus will be given priority over all other communities in this country? Does Article 21 say that if Hindu has been killed, that a 21 writ petition can be filed? If a non-Hindu is killed, no Article 21 rights are available. No, it doesn't. And that is the beauty of our country, and that is the beauty of our constitutional fathers, which today in this cacophony of social media and chest thumping television anchors, we lose sight of it. And we as lawyers, we as aware constitutional citizens of this country, we should be the first ones to recognize this. That when the entire world was being governed on such narrow parochial lines, in Israel, Judaism is their official religion. In the Islamic countries, Islam is their official religion. Even in UK, the Queen is the head of the church. But in India, our constitution, despite an overwhelming number of majority being of one particular religion, did not opt for an official state religion. That is the beauty of our constitution, and it is tremendous foresight on our constitutional fathers, foresight of those Indians at that point of time who accepted this. So the credit has to be given to our forefathers who were available, that they willingly accepted this constitution. They're very happy with it. So I think rather than terming it as unconstitutional, this is our greatest strength, and this strength somewhere is being lost. And regarding socialism, socialism, don't take it as a very narrow dogma as a synonym of communism. Socialism is something that equal distribution of resources, to see that the ones who are underprivileged do get adequate state support. So I don't think the interpretation of secularism and socialism should be something that is to be interpreted in the way that Facebook or social media or television anchors these days interpret. As students of law, we have to understand the true import. And I must tell you all that we have to be extremely proud of the constitution that came about in this country in 1950. And we, at all times, we among all the other classes of citizens in this country, we must be the first ones to protect it. Because this is what makes India unique. Among all the 200 nations in the country, our constitution is unique. And the day you desecrate the underlying spirit of a constitution and make it just like a constitution of Pakistan or Bangladesh or Israel or any other thing, that is the day when our uniqueness is lost. So please understand this, please, I can only beseech you that, this is something which all of you guys must, as students of constitutional law, appreciate about our constitution. Yeah, Bijay.
So, and the last question of the day, can you share your brief experience when you were the standing counsel of the state of Jammu and Kashmir?
So my lips are sealed. You say I can't say things beyond that. Of course, there are many things which may not be appropriate for me to disclose on a public forum. There are several pulls and pressures and things and so on and so forth. But what I can tell you, it was a very unique experience, because I come from Goregaon, just in case people don't know, I'm born and brought up in Bombay, in Supreme Court for a very long time now, spent more years in Delhi than in Mumbai. But but we come from states where there is no question of a separate constitution or a separate flag or separate legal regime, and that was the challenge. Because whether you are a standing council of Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, or a standing council he is the main lawyer for that state in the Supreme Court. So all the cases pertaining to that state have to go through him. So it was challenging for Jammu and Kashmir because J&K had its own constitution, own separate laws, which you don't get for any other state. Of course, now after 5th August 2019, that has been scrapped. But the constitution of J&K came about in 1957, 26 Jan 1957. So from 1957 till 2019, it had its own constitution, its own flag, it had its own separate laws, it had its separate CRPC, separate CPC, separate IPC. You see? Of course, large 90% they were a cut copy paste of the central CRPC and central IPC and so on and so forth. But they also had several local laws, hundreds of local laws. So that was the challenge. So you had to. It was as if it is not just merely a state. It was almost like a separate country. Whose laws you had to understand and master and argue. So that was the biggest challenge while being for that state. Yeah.
Sir, it was our privilege to have you here amongst us.
Privilege.
Thank you, sir.